The lights in the studio glared white. The air was electric, taut with the energy of two women who were never meant to share the same stage. On one end, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, crisp, composed, eyebrows arched in condescension. On the other, Representative Jasmine Crockett, steady, unblinking, her silence louder than the noise around her. Mid-sentence, Sanders leaned into her practiced cadence, voice laced with faux concern. The Constitution doesn't give Congress the right to interfere in matters of state enforcement. And then it happened. Jasmine Crockett blinked. Just once, then leaned forward. You don't know the law. Silence. Not the awkward kind, the stunned kind. Like the air had been vacuumed out of the room. One of the hosts gasped audibly. The other leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. For a moment, even Sarah Huckabee Sanders froze, as if her circuitry had shorted. And then Twitter lit up. Clips circulated before the segment had even finished airing. You don't know the law was already trending, carved into memes. TikToks stitched reactions from young law students who had just found their new favorite congresswoman. Some called it the Crockett Clapback. Others dubbed it a masterclass in graceful evisceration. But in that moment, live, unfiltered, national, it wasn't about virality. It was about truth. Sanders tried to recover, clearing her throat. Well, that's your interpretation, she said. Her voice clipped now, not quite as fluid. Her fingers twitched on the desk. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her expression carried the weight of every court brief she'd ever written, every protest she'd ever walked, every eye roll she'd ever endured in a room full of people who thought her brown skin and natural hair meant she didn't belong. And now millions were watching her remind America that credentials outlast charisma, and that some women fight not to be loud, but to be heard. But how did we get here? The answer lies in a build-up neither woman saw coming. 3 days before the broadcast, the country was already vibrating with tension. A Republican-backed bill in Arkansas had just passed, allowing the governor to unilaterally override prosecutorial decisions related to abortion access and racial bias complaints. A move critics called an authoritarian overreach. Supporters called it state sovereignty. Legal scholars were divided. Communities were not. Protests ignited in Little Rock and rippled across college campuses. Civil rights organizations drafted emergency lawsuits. Hashtags like Our Bodies, Our Laws, and the checks and balances surged to the top of trending pages. For millions, this wasn't theoretical. It was personal. The network saw an opportunity, a balanced roundtable. On one side, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, daughter of a political dynasty, seasoned in the art of deflection, PR rehearsed to the syllable. She'd flown in with a hair and makeup team, ready to push talking points in pearls and a smile. On the other side, Representative Jasmine Crockett, freshman congresswoman from Texas, civil rights attorney, sharp-tongued, unfiltered, and already gaining a reputation as the voice you don't see coming. Producers weren't sure if the chemistry would combust or fizzle. They didn't care. Either outcome would pull ratings. The days leading up, Sanders had done the cable circuit, praising the bill as a restoration of parental rights and a stand against federal intrusion. Her language was surgical, strategically empty. No real legal foundation, just emotional optics. It was theater, and she'd spent her life rehearsing. Crockett? She was quiet, focused. She hadn't tweeted in 2 days. No sound bites, no grandstanding, just a brief quote to a local journalist. If this is the hill she wants to legislate on, I hope she knows the law. Inside political circles, whispers grew louder. Was this the moment Crockett would break into the national spotlight? She was no stranger to pushing back against power, but facing down a governor with national ambitions on live television. That was a different battlefield. Millions tuned in for what was expected to be just another panel. A polite disagreement. In polished language, what they got instead would make headlines for weeks, because what happened that day wasn't a debate, it was a line in the sand, and one woman crossed it with a smile, thinking she was untouchable. The other was waiting. Armed with the truth, Sarah Huckabee Sanders was born into power. The daughter of former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, she grew up backstage in green rooms and campaign buses, trained from a young age in the choreography of politics. Power for Sarah was not earned. It was inherited. And with it came a confidence so unshakable it bordered on entitlement. By the time she became the youngest White House press secretary in modern history, she had perfected the art of dismissive diplomacy. She deflected. She pivoted. She reframed. Never concede, never clarify. Just smile, condescend, and move on. Behind the podium, she made a name for herself by stonewalling reporters, parroting President Trump's agenda, and delivering half-truths, with a raised eyebrow and folded arms. Her job wasn't to inform, it was to insulate, and in that, she thrived. So when Arkansas handed her the keys to the governor's mansion, it wasn't a transformation, it was an expansion. Within months of taking office, Sanders unleashed a legislative storm. A sweeping ban on critical race theory in schools, signed under the banner of restoring patriotic education. Book bans targeting authors of color and LGBTQ+ voices, masked as parental rights. A statewide executive order removing the term Latinx from all government communications, calling it cultural nonsense. And most recently, the bill that brought her to national attention again, granting herself, the governor, unilateral authority to override prosecutorial decisions on issues she deemed misaligned with Arkansas values. It was vintage Sanders, presented as clean governance, packaged for suburban parents, delivered with no regard for precedent or law. Her media appearances followed the same formula. Sit straight. Tilt head. Appear reasonable while launching not-so-subtle attacks. When asked tough questions, reframe. When challenged, smirk. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. Her real weapon was certainty, and that certainty had been unshaken. Until Jasmine. In the lead-up to the panel, Sanders had brushed off concerns about facing Crockett. Her staff reportedly joked about it behind closed doors. One aide described Crockett as loud TikTok energy, suggesting the Congresswoman wouldn't be a match for a governor who'd survived the Trump press corps. Sanders entered the studio with her signature calm, a conservative woman in command. She was the kind of figure networks booked when they needed polished pushback, someone who could play nice while gutting progressive narratives with surgical efficiency. But what Sarah didn't expect was that this wasn't Capitol Hill. It wasn't a Fox News hit piece. It wasn't a press briefing with planted questions. This was a room she didn't control, and across from her sat a woman who knew the law. Not just the sound bites, not just the spin, but the actual statutes, the case, precedents, the constitutional foundations. Sarah's entire political identity had been built on scripted dominance, but she was about to meet someone who didn't play by her rules. And didn't need to. Because in Crockett's world, the truth didn't need a teleprompter, and Sanders was seconds away from learning what it felt like to be interrupted. Not by noise, but by knowledge. Before the sharp suits, before the national headlines, before the hashtag moments, there was a young black woman in East Texas, standing alone outside a jail, holding a manila folder and waiting to defend a client who couldn't afford anyone else. Jasmine Crockett didn't grow up with power. She wasn't born into legacy. She earned her name in rooms that didn't want her there. Courtrooms, city, halls, protest lines. A civil rights attorney first, she built her reputation not with slogans, but with wins. She defended protesters arrested for speaking truth in the streets. She fought housing discrimination cases that wealthier attorneys ignored. And when local officials tried to push back, she didn't flinch. She filed motions. She found precedent. She went back the next day. In Dallas, her name spread quietly. At first, among organizers, single mothers, first-time defendants. "Call Jasmine," they'd say. "She'll actually fight." She didn't seek cameras. She sought justice, and that made her dangerous. It was only a matter of time before the courtroom walls couldn't contain her ambition. When she ran for the Texas House, the establishment rolled their eyes. She was too blunt, too bold, too black. But she won, not by watering herself down, but by speaking like no one else on the ballot. She told voters the truth, that Texas, politics were rigged against the working class, that voting was under siege, that being quiet wasn't going to save anyone. And when she stood on the House floor in white sneakers and afro curls and delivered a speech about voter suppression, that left the chamber stunned into silence. The clip went viral, not because it was loud, but because it was real. When Congress came calling, the stakes got higher. But Jasmine didn't change. She brought the same fire, the same folder-thick knowledge of constitutional law, and the same refusal to defer to power just because it wore a suit and tie. She stood up for reproductive rights when others stayed quiet. She challenged committee chairs to their faces. She corrected legal misstatements mid-session, not for applause, but because she could. Because someone had to. And slowly, the whispers began in D.C. hallways and cable news green rooms. "Don't go toe-to-toe with Crockett unless you've done your homework." She was precise, not theatrical. She didn't drown her opponents. She dismantled them, piece by piece, calmly, professionally, mercilessly. So when the panel was announced, Sanders versus Crockett, Jasmine didn't rush to Twitter. She didn't tease the segment. She didn't prep a clapback. She did what she always does. She read the bill. She read the law. She found the contradiction. She practiced saying just enough, and nothing more. Because she wasn't there to go viral. She was there to correct the record. And she wasn't just another panelist. She was the one person on set trained to take people like Sarah apart. Not with volume, not with outrage, but with facts sharp enough to silence a governor mid-sentence. And silence, as it turned out, was exactly what was coming next. Back in the studio, the camera panned slowly across the panel. The opening pleasantries had long evaporated. Now the gloves were off, at least for one of them. Sarah Huckabee Sanders spoke with the fluid ease of someone used to hearing herself in sound bites. "The left wants chaos. That's what this is," she said, brushing aside concerns about constitutional overreach with a dismissive wave of her hand. "This bill isn't about control. It's about restoring common sense to a state that's tired of being told what to do by D.C. elites." The host nodded, offering a smile as Sarah continued. "Congress needs to stop pretending they're smarter than the people who actually live in these communities." A jab. Light. Precise. Dismissive. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted. The pen in her hand, leaned slightly forward and said, "You're suggesting federal lawmakers should have no role in protecting constitutional rights?" Sanders didn't answer directly. She turned to the camera. "What Jasmine and others on her side don't understand is that states have a duty to protect their citizens, and that sometimes means keeping out bad policy pushed by Washington." Buzzwords. Again. No substance. Just crowd-tested rhetoric. Crockett nodded slowly. Still quiet. Sarah smirked. She thought she had found her rhythm. The governor launched into another rehearsed tangent. This one about how liberal activists were trying to weaponize the judiciary to override democracy. "Look," she said, raising her eyebrows condescendingly, "you can't just scream racism every time you lose in court. That's not how the Constitution works." The host chuckled nervously. Tension flickered through the room. Crockett's eyes narrowed just slightly. And then, the crack. Sanders leaned back and said it casually. This bill simply enforces what's already allowed under the 10th Amendment. Governors have discretion over prosecutorial oversight. That's just basic civics. The pause was deafening. Crockett tilted her head, then turned, slowly, to face Sanders fully. Her voice was low, but crisp. That's incorrect, and you just misquoted the law. The temperature dropped. One of the producers behind the glass leaned toward the screen. The host sat back in his chair. "I'm sorry?" Sanders asked, still smiling. "You just misquoted the 10th Amendment," Jasmine replied. "And no, governors do not have unilateral authority to override prosecutorial independence. Not without triggering constitutional scrutiny. That's not basic civics. That's bad governance." Sarah blinked. The host tried to interject, but the air had shifted. The crowd wasn't breathing. The room was waiting. Crockett leaned in. "You're talking about states' rights, like it's a blank check. But what you're ignoring is precedent. You're ignoring due process. You're ignoring the balance of power that protects people from exactly this kind of political manipulation." Sanders opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She looked caught, not cornered, but unprepared. For the first time, the confidence in her posture seemed performative. Forced? And Crockett? She hadn't even raised her voice. She didn't need to, because this wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a dissection. And while Sanders had spent the first 10 minutes thinking she was winning, Jasmine was just warming up. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let the silence do the heavy lifting. The kind of silence that demands attention, not by force, but by truth. Across the table, Sarah Huckabee Sanders adjusted her posture. Her eyes darted for a moment, toward the host, toward the teleprompter, then back to Jasmine. Her smirk had faded just slightly into something more mechanical. And then Jasmine spoke. "You said the 10th Amendment gives you the authority to override prosecutors," she began. "But that's not what it says. The 10th doesn't grant power. It reserves it. And what you're doing isn't preservation of state rights. It's abuse of executive discretion." The host shifted in his seat. "Discretion doesn't mean domination. It doesn't mean rewriting the rules because you don't like the outcome. You don't get to claim the Constitution while ignoring everything it's built on. Due process, equal protection, checks and balances." A beat passed. Then Jasmine leaned forward, her tone sharpening without ever getting louder. "And since you brought up basic civics, Governor, let's talk about actual precedent." She reached for the folder in front of her. Slim, neat, purposeful. Prince v. United States, 1997. The Supreme Court ruled that states cannot be forced to execute federal law, yes, but they also affirmed that state officials cannot nullify federal protections through unilateral fiat. You would have known that if you'd read past the headline. Sanders opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Then there's United States versus Lovett, 1946. The court struck down executive overreach when it targeted individuals without judicial process. And let's not forget Bond versus United States, where the court acknowledged individual rights within states can't be trampled by state claims of autonomy. The split screen tightened. Sanders on one side, eyes flickering, jaw locked. Crockett on the other, composed, relentless. The host's eyes widened. The earpiece in his left ear crackled with silence. Control room didn't know whether to cut to commercial or lean in. But Jasmine wasn't finished. "You're not protecting citizens," she said, turning toward Sanders. "You're protecting your power. You're rewriting the rules to punish prosecutors who don't fall in line. That's not constitutional. That's authoritarian." Then she turned to the host. "And the most dangerous part is that it sounds reasonable. It sounds like leadership, but it's manipulation dressed in law." Social media was already catching fire. "Know the law, Jasmine slayed." Mic drop Crockett clips looped the moment Crockett leaned forward. Memes flashed, "You don't know the law," in bold Helvetica over Sanders's stunned expression. TikToks stitched her citations into 15-second law lessons. The internet was doing what the internet does, amplifying the moment truth broke through spin. But back in the studio, it was still unfolding. Sanders looked straight ahead, her face caught between disbelief and denial. "Let me respond," she said, voice unsteady. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She waited. Sanders tried to recalibrate. "Congresswoman Crockett is entitled to her opinion." "It's not opinion," Jasmine cut in smoothly. "It's law." The host looked at the camera like he'd just witnessed a trial verdict. We'll have to come back to that," he mumbled, unsure of what else to say. But Jasmine wasn't done, because this moment wasn't about the panel anymore. It was about the message. And so as Sanders sat in stunned silence, Jasmine turned, to the camera, to the millions watching, and said something nobody expected. "You don't have to be loud to be right. You just have to know what you're talking about. And too many people in power are counting on you not knowing the difference." Pause. She held the gaze of the lens like it was a courtroom jury. "So learn the difference." Fade. Cut to black. The moment had passed, but the ripple was just beginning. The clip hit Twitter 43 seconds after the show cut to commercial. By the time the segment resumed, it had already passed 220,000 views. In under 2 hours, "You don't know the law" was a national headline. Clipped, captioned, and circulated with the kind of fury that couldn't be bought, only sparked. TikTok exploded with remixes. One creator looped Jasmine's takedown over Kendrick Lamar's DNA. Another stitched her quotes into a fake courtroom scene, casting her as a superhero lawyer defending America from gaslighting. Hashtags climbed like wild vines. Jasmine slayed, Mic drop moment, Crockett v. Sanders, know the law, and Ewer. Then came the memes. Split screens of Sanders blinking while Jasmine cited case law, side-by-sides with courtroom dramas. Elle Woods could never. Someone edited the moment into a Law and Order cold open, complete with the gavel sound. Gen Z crowned her the legal queen we didn't know we needed. Millennials called her the political antidote to smugness. But it wasn't just the meme makers. Within 12 hours, the New York Times published an op-ed titled "The Power of Precision, Jasmine Crockett, and the New Face of Political Lawfare." MSNBC replayed the segment 6 times in one day. Legal experts on CNN called it a masterclass in constitutional accountability. Even Politico, usually measured, headlined, "Crockett breaks the internet, and the governor's argument." On the other side, Fox News was scrambling. The morning panel tried to downplay the moment, calling Crockett rude, aggressive, and unprofessional. But the video was unavoidable and unspinnable. Even some conservative legal analysts begrudgingly admitted she was right. And Sanders? She went silent. No post-show interview, no rebuttal. Her team issued a generic statement hours later. Governor Sanders stands by her defense of Arkansas values. No mention of the legal errors. No attempt to clarify, because by then the story had already evolved. It wasn't just about one panel. It was about what Crockett represented. College students began sharing the clip in law forums and campus groups, writing things like, "This is why I applied to law school." First-generation immigrants tweeted, "I've never seen someone who looks like me hold power like that," with facts, not fury. Teachers showed it in government class. Civic orgs included it in Know Your Rights presentations. Celebrities chimed in. Kerry Washington tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett, say her name." Mark Ruffalo reposted the clip with the caption, "This is how you shut down disinformation, with the Constitution." And Ava DuVernay simply wrote, "A queen with receipts." Donors took notice, too. Crockett's campaign site saw a 400% spike in donations that weekend. Small dollar donors flooded in, many including notes like, "More of this, please," and "For every time you've had to explain the law to someone who refuses to listen." Back in Washington, whispers turned into declarations. Congressional progressives praised her calm. Legal scholars wrote entire threads breaking down her citations. Even moderates, normally allergic to conflict, admitted, "She didn't start it, but she sure finished it." Meanwhile, Sanders avoided press for the next 48 hours. Because this wasn't just TV. This became a moment in America's cultural and political timeline. And everyone, from teenagers on TikTok to senators on Capitol Hill, knew exactly who Jasmine Crockett was now. Not just a congresswoman, not just a lawyer, but a truth-teller, and a force to be reckoned with. The camera had long stopped rolling, but her words kept echoing. "You don't have to be loud to be right. You just have to know what you're talking about." It wasn't a catchphrase. It was a compass, pointed straight at a generation raised to believe that the loudest voice always wins. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She didn't interrupt. She didn't posture. She educated, and in doing so, she reminded America of something we've been conditioned to forget: that dignity, when wielded with knowledge, is more powerful than any punchline. For Black women especially, her moment resonated. Beyond politics. It was about permission, not to perform but to stand grounded. Not to be palatable, but to be prepared. Not to entertain, but to educate. For every time a woman of color had been dismissed, talked over, or accused of being emotional, Jasmine had delivered the ultimate rebuttal: calm brilliance. And for everyone watching who'd ever been underestimated by a teacher, boss, a talking head on TV, her takedown of Sanders wasn't just satisfying, it was healing. She had come to the table not to go viral, but to correct the record. And in doing so, she reminded millions that facts still matter, that truth is still elegant, that there is still a place for intelligence in public discourse. They can, even if it's not always the loudest seat at the table. The moment also cracked open deeper questions. Who gets to be seen as reasonable? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Why are sharp, prepared Black women framed as aggressive, while smug, underprepared officials are allowed to stumble with grace? In Jasmine's poise, there was protest. In her clarity, a quiet revolution. She didn't call Sanders a name. She didn't storm off the set. She just made the truth undeniable. And by doing so, she gave viewers a roadmap. Not just for politics, but for everyday life. Because this moment wasn't just about Jasmine and Sarah. It was about us. About knowing your rights. About knowing your power. About what happens when someone refuses to shrink in the face of authority, and instead speaks, calmly and confidently, with facts. It was about being underestimated, and flipping that into an advantage. It was about the power of being underestimated by the wrong person on the wrong day, and deciding to educate them anyway. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win the debate. She raised the bar, and reminded us all that real power doesn't need to yell. It teaches. She didn't scream. She didn't grandstand. She just told the truth, and let the silence do the rest. Jasmine Crockett's moment wasn't just about fact-checking a governor. It was about reminding an entire nation that intelligence still matters, that preparation still matters, that truth still matters. In an era where disinformation is currency, where confidence is mistaken for competence, where loud voices dominate, and substance is drowned out, she chose a different path. She chose clarity, so if you felt that moment in your chest, if you saw yourself in her strength, in her restraint, in her unapologetic brilliance, then don't just scroll. Join us, because this platform isn't just here to react, it's here to remember, to document these moments, to shine a spotlight on the people who are shifting the narrative, not with rage, but with reason. So like this video, Share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe, not just for more content, but for more accountability. Because in a world where noise wins the news cycle, truth still wins hearts. And the more of us who speak it, the louder it echoes.